Strange Shadows, a Clark Ashton Smith podcast.
There are many marvellous tales, untold, unwritten, never to be recorded or remembered, lost beyond all divining and all imagining, that sleep in the double silence of far recessive time and space. The chronicles of Saturn, the archives of the moon in its prime, the legends of Antilia and Moaria, these are full of an unsurmised and forgotten wonder. And strange are the multitudinous tales withheld by the light years of Polaris and the galaxy. But none is stranger, none more marvellous than the tale of Hotar and Evidon and their voyage to the planet Sfanamoe from the last isle of foundering Atlantis.
Hello friends, and welcome to episode 17 of Strange Shadows, the Clark Ashton Smith podcast. The voice you just heard was Shelley de Cruz from Graveheart Designs, reading the opening paragraph of today's story. And indeed, it's the last story of season 1. I'm one of your hosts, Rob Poynton.
And I'm the other one, Tim Mendes. Yeah, it's strange coming to the end of the series, but we're going out in a bit of a bang because we've got a guest with us this week. He's a familiar face. Joining us from the frozen north is Mr. Gavin Chappell.
Hello.
Hey Gavin, how you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing all right, actually, yeah. Haven't had any morphine recently, so not quite as jolly as I have been in the past. But
That was funny. Was that the Feast of Fools launch? I think it was.
Yeah.
Yeah. You got this grin all night.
And Gavin, of course, is a writer and is editor of Lovecraftiana magazine and the Schlock website. And I think you've got a new Lovecraftiana coming out shortly.
Yeah, well, I've got a new Lovecraftiana. I can edit it, but I can't pronounce it. And another Schlock coming out as well. But the Lovecraftiana, the Candlemas 2023 edition, is quite special because it's a celebration of 100 years of weird fiction, being 100 years since Weird Tales first began in 1923.
Nice.
Excellent. Yes, look forward to that. And of course, that's also something we're making, or part of the subject for the forthcoming Innsmouth Literary Festival as well. We're just confirming the venue at the moment. Looks like it's definitely going to be September the 30th at the Bedford venue. So once again, of course, as we got all the details, we'll be putting those out.
Yeah, and today we're covering I think it's the second one of his Poseidonis stories, isn't it? We're covering A Voyage to Sfanamoe, or however you pronounce it.
Yeah, well, how are we? I was going for Sfanamoe. What do you reckon, Gavin?
I was thinking something a bit more Tolkien-esque, like Sfanamoe.
Yeah.
I don't think I could actually wrap my tongue around that, so I'm going to go with Sfanamoe.
I think that's the point of most of Clark Ashton Smith, Lovecraft, and Saney, a lot of them. If you can get your tongue around it, you're doing something wrong.
I don't know. I had it in my mind for some reason. This is going to be another one of those sort of sci-fi stories with the same cast as the Marooned in Andromeda, and I was quite surprised when it was Poseidonis and Venus in this one. It seems like a combination of his two genres, his fantasy and his science fiction genres.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I read this a long time ago because I think it was included in Lost Worlds Volume 2. I think it was Volume 2.
You're right. And
it is a good one. It's a strange mix because you've got the sort of sci-fi stuff, but you've also got you've got a lot of the really flowery language that he keeps in his fantasy stuff. And some great descriptions that were in this, some great ones.
So, shall we get on to our favourite words, speaking of descriptions?
Indeed.
What have we got lined up this time?
Right, I think the first one I'm going to go with is volute, or volute, which is a scroll-like adornment on ionic columns. It's also a variety of marine snail and a type of air pump. It's basically spiral or scroll-shaped.
Nice. What about you, Gavin? What have you picked?
I was quite interested by the Lost Worlds that he mentions at the start, Antilia and Moaria. Antilia I'd heard of, Moaria, there was quite a new one to me. As far as I can work out, it's a kind of Lemuria, but with New Zealand and that sort of area,
Cool.
which someone cooked up. But I think he missed a trick in the first. I think it's one of the. Is it the first paragraph? Yeah, he said. He says, "Where the past and future are always contemporary with the present." He could have said contemporaneous.
Ah,
Like I should say on a bad day there.
A rare slip there from Mr. Smith. Yeah. But I think he makes up for it with consanguinity.
Consanguinity is a good one.
yes.
Because you could just say people are brothers, which is basically what it means, or they're blood relations anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was a nice word. And I also liked crucidaceous as well.
Mm.
There's a few botanical words in this one, isn't there?
Yeah, one of the other ones I picked up on was calyxes, I think, which is the cup-like sepals. Calyx, there you go. Yeah. Calyxes.
Yeah.
They're the cup-like sepals on a flower. And there was also orchidaceous, or
orchidaceous, is it?
Orchidaceous, that's it. It's my writing.
Yeah.
I thought that was an N. It's a U, which means resembling orchids or ostentatious.
I did not know that.
Yeah,
I like the typhonic power of the atom. Ooh. This is a wonderful way of describing atomic power, particularly in 1931.
Yeah, because we're at the dawn of the atomic age there, aren't we? Really?
Indeed.
Yeah, well, it was all theoretical at that point.
Yeah.
I mean, H.G. Wells did come up with the idea of atom bombs earlier than this, but science took a long time to actually catch up with weird fiction writers, or science fiction writers.
Well, look how long it took. Look how long it took us to get the flip phone from Star Trek.
That's right.
I'm still waiting for my phaser, personally.
My hoverboard. Yeah, that's what I want. My hoverboard from Back to the Future.
But I did read somewhere that there was some science fiction writer of the 40s wrote a story about atomic power, and someone from the Manhattan Project came round for a word. I say, how do you know about all this? Well, it's just basic science, everyone knows about it.
Wow.
In trouble with the Men in Black.
They were there even then. Is that one of the earliest Men in Black sightings, do you think? I wonder if there were ones before that. Perhaps they were monks in black before that.
Oh, there's a story idea in that, isn't there? Yeah.
And I'm going to finish with one more word, which is diluvial.
Nice.
Which, of course, then I thought, oh yes, antediluvian, yes, relating to floods. So it got a nice ring to it, I thought.
Yeah, I think the final one I'm going to go with is one I've heard before, but manumission, which is the freeing of slaves. It's also a series of parties in Ibiza and a hotel in Manchester.
Very liberating.
Indeed. But I thought that it was interesting because in the next paragraph after he mentions that, he's talking about the fact that Poseidonis at this time was a whole year-long party as the place is dying. So it's like maybe Poseidonis is Ibiza. Yeah,
Ibiza is.
Yeah.
We found Atlantis.
Smith invented the rave scene.
I quite like the bit about how they devoted long years research to the obscure telluric laws governing the imminent catastrophe. Telluric meaning to do with the Earth. So not quite as interesting as it sounds, to be honest.
Nice.
Well, we've got a fine collection in there. Considering this is a fairly short story, we've already got a fine crop of words there. Yeah. So, how did he get on with selling this one?
Yeah, quite well. Surprising, because the first half of this series, obviously he couldn't get anything published for love nor money. But then he wrote this between July the 13th and the 17th, 1930, and it was immediately snapped up by Farnsworth Wright and featured in the August 1931 issue of Weird Tales. It's interesting because you've noticed that the more sci-fi leaning ones tend to get picked, whereas the more horrific ones, Wright tends to go no. So I wonder if that's a personal preference, just pure speculation on my part there. But
do you think that was like a fashion thing at the time? The science fiction was coming into fashion, perhaps?
I guess so. Yeah. He was paid $30 for it, which, to be fair, that's not bad for. I mean, because I guess it's a couple of thousand words, I guess.
Yeah. Long.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get into the story then. And I think one unusual thing with this one, it's told from the point of view of this. It reminded me a bit of like the sort of Watcher, or was it Galactus from Marvel Comics? It seems to be this being who's watching everything that's going on all the time. It's quite an odd perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people complain about the lack of logic in the story, but basically the first paragraph says it's a dream.
Mm.
It's like Dunsany and a lot of Lovecraft stories. It's not necessarily real.
And we get this nice little mention of these legendary things, some of which are, well, the Chronicles of Saturn. I imagine that's fictitious. Well, maybe there are Chronicles of Saturn somewhere, but we've yet to lay eyes on them.
Maybe there are archives on the moon.
Oh, yes. Yes, the dark side of the moon.
Archives on the Moon. There's a band name already.
That's good. Yeah. And I'd not actually heard of Antilia before. I thought maybe Antilia and Moaria were fictitious as well. But as you mentioned, Antilia was quite a well-known legend.
Yeah. Well, Antilia was a legend, and then Columbus discovered the Caribbean, and the Caribbean islands are divided into the Greater Antilles and the Lesser Antilles, the Great Cuba and that being the Greater Antilles, and the smaller ones.
Ah, of course.
But that's because they're named after Antilia. They're expecting to find Antilia round there. It wasn't there. So that's what the islands of the Caribbean are named after.
Didn't know that. I didn't know that.
Right. Yeah.
And I think the legend itself dates from around the 15th century, although it's said to be from an older story about 7 bishops who were fleeing the Muslim conquest, I guess, of Spain and Portugal.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, Visigothic bishops.
Yes, yeah. And they set up 7 settlements on this island and burnt their boats so they couldn't return.
Yes.
And some speculate that the name is from the Portuguese for opposite island. It was thought to be quite opposite Portugal. Of course, I suppose it sounds a little bit like Atlantis as well, doesn't it? There's maybe a connection there.
Yeah. And
Moaria, as you said, again, I'd totally not heard of that at all. And I can find very little information on it other than it sounds like sort of pre-cataclysmic New Zealand and the Polynesian islands.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think... Now, I know Lemuria, the idea of Lemuria is that there were lemurs in Madagascar and lemurs in India. So the idea was there must have been a continent in between the two, joining them. And that's how you got them in the two places. Moaria, presumably it's from Moa, the extinct flightless birds. So I assume that they found evidence of Moa elsewhere in Polynesia. And that's what the Moaria is from. But I couldn't find very much about it either.
Yeah, I'm not even sure where the legend is from, what culture or what background it's from at all.
Very obscure.
But it is interesting that we're setting up the story with these legends, and then the story is actually set on another legendary place, Poseidonis, which is the remnants of Atlantis, because we're post the fall of Atlantis, aren't we?
Yeah.
And we have these 2 brothers, Hotar and Evidon.
Yeah.
Now, the only interesting thing I could find here was Hotar is a class of Vedic priest, basically ancient Hindu priest, and they were wanderers. They were like hermits who'd wander around the forest. They were like carried out a forest tradition. So not much connection with the story because these 2 guys are scientists, really. But nothing is by accident, is it, with Smith? So.
No.
And one thing that I thought was interesting with these guys is they seem to have mastered everything. Biology, chemistry, physics, mathematics. And I thought that was interesting in that nowadays, I think they say even with mathematics, people have to specialise in maths because no one person can take in the whole of mathematics as it stands at the moment.
What I like is it's Atlantis, obviously far, far back in prehistory, if it ever existed. And yet they've got to a point where science has gone beyond what it was in Clark Ashton Smith's own day.
Yeah.
And of course, it all vanished into nothingness.
Yeah, and that's a recurring theme of Smith's stuff, isn't it? These great civilizations with these great advancements and profound knowledge that then fall into decadence and decay. It's that's a recurring theme.
Lost forever.
Yeah.
And well, it seems to be a common theme with the Atlantean myth as well, that they had this ancient technology and flying saucers and all sorts of things, anti-gravity devices, which was how, of course, the pyramids were built. And
Of course, and Stonehenge. I think it goes back to Blavatsky, really, doesn't it? Because she talked about all these different root races and Lemuria and Atlantis and so on. Atlantis, they definitely had airships, and they were about 12 feet tall and green or something like that. I don't know. It's a while since I last read it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And let's just mention this here, because I also thought later on, these guys, their bloodline specifically is mentioned. They're described as noble, high Atlantean stock. And this put me in mind of Tolkien and Numenor, which seemed to be exactly the same thing. I'm not sure that Numenor was so technically advanced in terms of airships and that kind of stuff, but it was certainly a high culture.
That also goes back to Blavatsky, because all those sort of Aryan master race theories, they have a lot to do with the Blavatsky and the idea that there were higher evolutionary kinds of humanity in the past, the Aryans, the Atlanteans, and so on. They're all sort of connected.
Yeah. I mean, we get the mention here of they use the Aboriginal Atlantean slaves as well, don't they? Which, always a slightly distasteful.
Yes. Yeah. And the fact that they're actually they're dumb as well, aren't they?
Deaf mute.
And deaf. Yeah. They're deaf mutes, yeah. So they don't know what's going on, and they can't tell anybody what's going on. That's,
I just wonder how useful that is in a slave.
Go and do this. What was that? What did you say? What did you say?
I think he wants us to put the cat out.
What did you say? What did you say?
Hey? I couldn't even say that. I reckon they had chalkboards, or perhaps they had like Atlantean iPads.
Yes, could be runic iPads.
Oh, that's great.
Runic iPads.
There should be an app for that.
I like the fact that the society has got, they've got these two brotherly scientists who have got all these incredible technological powers. You got everyone, well, the majority of people just getting drunk all the time, and it's got slavery, but it's got technology. It's got high technology. It's got but at the same time, it's got this kind of primitiveness of, ancient Egypt or Rome or that kind of thing. The savagery and the callousness.
Yeah. Because they keep this stuff really secret, don't they?
Yeah.
And
they're supposed to be finding a way to stop Atlantis sinking, but actually they say, sod it. Let's just find some way of building a spaceship so we can fly to Venus, get away from it all. But maybe I'm giving away a bit too much of the plot.
Well, no. I mean, it reminded me a bit of was it the 2012 film where they've got that big sort of, was it like a sort of ship or something, wasn't it? Mm. They have all the great and the good and the rich and the famous get on board the big ship. Yeah. It sort of reminded me of that, except they've got this huge ship with just two of them on it and everyone else can swim.
Yeah, there's a rich seam of fiction with that sort of arc kind of thing, isn't there? Like whether it be a space arc or some kind of portal or things like that. There's a lot of it going on, and I think we've got like quite an early version of it here with these two guys in their big flying beach ball or whatever it is.
But they don't take, unlike the Ark, they don't take anything which will help them to build a new civilization. That there's two guys, brothers. They're not going to start a new world, unless Atlanteans were different, which they might well have been. Who knows?
That's a good point, actually, because the point then was just to escape this watery doom and not to even start a new civilization or colony or anything.
That's right.
It's almost purely out of scientific curiosity, perhaps.
And selfishness.
Yeah.
And selfishness,
Yeah. It's another example of them, that sort of monomania you see in a lot of Smith's characters. Like above all everything else, it's the pursuit of knowledge and science and things like that. And everybody else is going to die. Who cares? We're going to see Venus.
So yes, they're looking at Venus in particular through their equipment, through their telescopes. And Venus is their name for Venus is Sfanamoe. This is the planet which drew their curiosity and their conjecture more than any other. I guess it's the brightest object in the sky, right? So it would be natural you'd look at that. And we do start getting some of the lovely language here as well with Smith. I particularly liked this sentence. Day by day, the brothers toiled to perfect their invention, and night by night through the ranging seasons, they peered at the lustrous orb of their speculations as it hung in the emerald evening of Poseidonis, or above the violet-shrouded heights that would soon take the saffron footprints of the dawn. That's lovely, isn't it? Saffron Footprints of the Dawn.
Yes. Yeah.
Album title. And like Tim says, they build this. Well, I was kind of picturing a Death Star.
It is a bit. Well, that's in my head, I saw it in black and white, and I saw it as that thing from The Prisoner, but on a bigger scale.
Oh,
you know, the beach ball that chases him around Fourth Merion.
Yeah, yeah.
Wasn't the H.G. Wells's Moon story from the, what's it called? Is it From the Earth to the Moon? No, that's Verne, isn't it? It's First Men on. I can't remember what it's called, but I think they've got a circular spaceship in that.
Right.
That they go to the moon in. I could be wrong there. So Wells, as I read it.
I suppose it kind of makes sense in a way, doesn't it? Because flying saucers didn't come in until, what, the 40s. Rocket ships would have maybe started around this time, the idea of a rocket.
Yeah. Well, rocket ships have a lot to do with the V1 and the V2, but yeah, how did you travel through space before all that? Those various things. I suppose rockets do make some kind of sense. But yeah, a round ball. It's one of the things I like about this. It's got none of the kind of baggage of science fiction or fantasy.
Yes.
It's like, I'm going to come up with a fantastic story about, and we'll have some kind of spaceships here, and we'll have Atlantis, and we'll just chuck in anything, and well, we'll see what happens in the end.
We get a little bit about the power source, but
Yes. Yeah.
they're on this thing for decades, and there's no mention of food or air or anything. There's very little technical about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's another masterclass in world building and atmosphere over plot, I think, because the plot is quite minimal, but how the story is so rich is in that sort of world building and visualization of it. I mean, I can picture this thing floating up into the atmosphere. You know, so it's a great image, that bit where it's rising above Poseidonis.
Yeah.
So
it is described in some detail. A dozen small round windows lined with an unbreakable glass. You thought about that? And explosion of atoms in sealed cylinders was to furnish the propulsive and levitative power, and would also serve to heat the sphere's interior against the absolute cold of space. There's some, real scientific thinking going in there.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. And we have this idea of going through the ether again that we mentioned before about it. It was thought that the gaps between planets was filled with this almost like a liquidy sort of substance.
It wasn't until Einstein that they that was debunked.
That's why in space no one can hear you scream.
Yes. And again, I just think of Me-Go wings.
Yeah.
That's all. Whenever anybody says the ether, I think of Me-Go wings. It's just, I just don't know. It's just my brain.
That sounds like a side order in a very dodgy Innsmouth restaurant.
Yeah.
Who ordered the Me-Go wings?
Oh man, that's brilliant. That's a pearl and scream right there.
Tastes like chicken, so I'm told.
Yes.
It always does.
And then I thought it was interesting that we get this. There's no rush about this, although it's quite a short story. And I mean, obviously, you can condense all that time into a couple of sentences, but this voyage takes decades.
Yeah.
And it seems to be quite a time, even getting up into space. And of course, when they look back, Poseidonis has already disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have these, we're not sure how many decades, but in my mind, it seems like 40, 50 years perhaps or something. Time enough to grow a huge long beard all the way down to the floor. That was a nice touch.
Yes.
I was like, just because they're growing them in space.
Space beards.
I like the way they spotted this before we move on. It was just when they'd finished creating this bubble of silver, as it's described. They noticed the planet Sfanamoe was now visible at eventide beyond the purpling sea of the jungle.
Oh, nice.
I just wanted to include that because I love that line.
And also, we sort of touched on it a little bit when they take off. All the partying and reveling is still going on below, which put me in mind of the previous story where the planet is doomed. But let's just party on, dudes. Let's go out in style.
It's like on a much smaller scale, the Millennium, when everyone was convinced that the Millennium bug was going to have planes crashing out the sky. What should we do about it? Oh, let's just get pissed.
Yeah, have a party.
Yeah, exactly.
So then, similar to the immeasurable horror, we get very vivid description of Venus, and it's it's not quite as jungly perhaps, but it's certainly as verdant and as bountiful in terms of flora and fauna.
Yeah, lots of flowers. It's the general impression you get.
Yeah, I couldn't help wondering, because obviously he wrote this after the last story we touched on, the immeasurable horror, which was this big shockothy thing crashing through the. So I wondered if that was on like they landed on a part of the planet, and this shockothy thing was just a few miles that way. So no.
Could be. But I get the impression he just wrote a story about Venus and then wrote another story about Venus. I think you get some of a picture of Venus as a fully formed planet in some of the stories, but I think this is just it's Venus in the days of Atlantis.
And it's more like maybe just to make the point of the story rather than anything else, to deliver the punchline in a way. It's just setting up the punchline. But I did like this. So when they land, there seem to be a million odours in the heavy, strange, unstirring air. Odours that were almost visible in the form of wreathing vapours, perfumes that were like elixirs and opiates that conferred at the same time a blissful drowsiness and a divine exhilaration. And then I suppose we can speculate how much of what happens after that is a result of this exhilaration.
Yeah.
Like elixirs and opiates. Yeah.
We might have a touch of the unreliable narrator going on because they're completely stoned.
Yeah. Also, the whole thing is a dream.
Yes. Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, it has that quite dreamlike quality from this point on, doesn't it? We've had the sort of hard science, and now we're almost sort of Alice in Wonderland.
Maybe it is just an opium fever dream. You know, it's one of those. It's a good trip, man. You know,
yeah, trip to Venus.
Trip to Venus, yeah.
And I did like this little line as well. We get orchidaceous in here as well. But they perceive certain animals new to zoology who are trotting about on more than the usual number of legs, with orchidaceous blossoms springing from their rumps. So this is like an 8-legged horse with flowers growing out of its arse, basically.
Okay.
That's a wonderful image.
Hey, man, we've all been there, man. We've all been there.
I just have this vision of Clark Ashton Smith and the police officer saying, "And how do you spell that, Mr. Smith?"
Oh, that's brilliant. Yeah. Pulled him over at the side of the road in Auburn, you know.
Actually, it sounds a bit like an Uruk-hai with attitude to me.
Yeah.
You know? Orchidaceous.
Whoa. Orchidaceous man.
Krishnak.
Yeah, that's one of those creatures that somebody needs to. I know it's not, you know, a popular thing to talk about, but these AI things, somebody needs to put in that line into one of them.
Oh, that'd be interesting.
Yeah.
So that'd be a mid journey to Sfanamoe then.
Mid journey to Sfanamoe. I love it. Yeah. And
let's not spark a debate, listeners, on the merits or otherwise of AI. There's quite enough of that going on Facebook at the moment, so let's put that to one side. I did kind of like it in that you've got these quite sort of seem hard-bitten scientists and philosophers, and they end up in this childlike state of basically wandering around going, flowers.
But it's the pollen, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
The snowy clouds of golden and snowy pollen which fell upon them from the arching arbors were potent as some fantastic drugs. Now, it reminds me a bit of, is it The Seed from the Sepulchre?
Yeah.
There's a story where someone just goes, one of his more normal seeming stories, someone goes on an expedition into South American jungle, and then encounters some kind of plant, and the next thing you know, he's got a seed growing out of his brain. Skull cracks open, real body horror stuff. It reminds me of that, but a bit gentler.
I often wondered if that was the inspiration for the old PC adventure game Dark Seed, which had all the H.R. Geiger artwork in it. Oh, yeah. because that was about like a guy who got a seed growing in his brain and all this kind of stuff.
A gruesome idea.
It also reminds me of a lot of Hope Hodgson's stuff. I mean, in that it wasn't pollen; it was always fungal spores, wasn't it? With Hodgson,
It'll be fungal.
Yeah, he loved his fungi, didn't he, Hope Hodgson? Fungi and pigs. Very.
I wonder if that inspired the rats in the walls. Actually, the fungus porcine things down there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Never thought of that before, but there's a similarity, isn't there?
Yeah.
Yeah. But what I like about this, I was listening to someone else's podcast on this, and they were saying, it would be a kind of horrific ending. They die, but it's not horrific. But I think it is horrific. I think it's horrific because they're giggling to themselves out of their minds on pollen, and they end up dying.
Yeah.
It's horrific because it's so nice. It's like a trap.
It brings to mind. Was it called The Ruins? That film where then people go. It's an old Mayan ruin in Mexico, and they get taken over by this vegetation. Yeah. And it reminds me of the Doctor Who, The Seeds of Doom, the Tom Baker story which was a bit of a homage to The Thing, to be fair. Yeah. But that had the whole seed pod taking over bodies and people turning into big shambling plant monsters.
Yeah, it is quite a. I suppose it's playing on the fears of being infected and being. Yeah, imagine what it'd be like if some kind of plant started growing inside you. Like when you're a kid and you eat a cherry and you swallow a stone and you think, oh my God, is there going to be a cherry tree growing out of me?
Maybe that's what happened to that 8-legged horse. Maybe that's why maybe he ate a bulb or something. There you go.
I was sort of thinking of Invasion of the Body Snatchers as well, and pod people and that kind of stuff, where it's almost like a reverse Swamp Thing. The plants become the humans. What Swamp Thing is debatable, I know, because there's a couple of the Alan Moore version had a slightly different take, but that idea of being taken over. And actually, I saw today, I think it was a picture of a grasshopper that had been taken over by. Oh, Tim, you always say the phrase
cordyceps.
That's the one. Yeah,
cordyceps fungus. Yeah,
and obviously it's a grasshopper, so I suppose it doesn't have particular sentience or anything. But you can't help feeling sorry for this thing that has got spines and spores growing out of it. It looked horrible.
Well, how that usually works? It's usually with ants, and basically it takes over the brain of the ants and makes them climb up onto. It basically turns them into zombies. It takes them up onto high branches of trees and plants, makes them bite down on branches, and then they stay there, and then it blooms. And it's quite topical at the minute because they've just brought out the Last of Us TV series based on the video games, and that's the whole concept of that. These are zombies created by the cordyceps fungus, but instead of it doing it to ants, it's done it to people.
Wow.
So yeah.
So Smith was there first. He was
Indeed,
there 100 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, it is interesting how many tropes we get from these writers. Smith, Lovecraft, and Howard come to that as well. And obviously they've got their influences. We mentioned Dunsany, and we see some of Poe and those things. But it seems to me a lot of their ideas were quite original as well.
Yeah, well, they wouldn't have the reputation they have these days if there wasn't something at the back of it, something powerful. I mean, there are a lot of things you could criticize. Obviously, the purple prose is not exactly fashionable these days, and there are all sorts of things that you could possibly complain about if you were feeling particularly critical. But the ideas are just incredible.
Yeah,
and we do get this lovely description of the process.
Oh yeah.
Suddenly Hotar cried out with a new wonder and laughed with a more boisterous mirth than before. He had seen that an oddly folded leaf was starting from the back of his shrunken right hand. The leaf unfurled as it grew. It disclosed a flower bud, and lo, the bud opened and became a triple chalice blossom of unearthly hues, adding a rich perfume to the swooning air.
Nice.
And then the leaves and petals were burgeoning from his wrinkled face and brow, were growing in successive tiers from his limbs and body, were mingling their hair-like tendrils and tongue-shaped pistils with his beard. He felt no pain, only an infantile surprise and bewilderment as he watched them.
Yeah. I think that infantile surprise no pain, only infantile surprise and bewilderment. That is the real horror of it all.
Yeah.
Mm.
I've just realised reading this how much some of this description is what I've written in my novella Miracle Growth, because that's all about this kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I wrote that ages ago before I'd read this. So let's just put that. I'm just putting that out there.
When I first read this, it was one of those Clark Ashton Smith stories where you read it, and you go, "Oh, you're right," but reading it back and a few more times, there are so many different elements to it that are just incredible. I mean, the scientific advancements of this prehistoric civilization that's vanishing into the waves, the spacecraft, and the planet, the way Venus is beautiful yet horrific, and what happens to them. Incredible.
And none of it's jarring, is it? You know, you sometimes read sword and planet things, or sometimes in sword and sorcery stories they'll bust out ray guns or something like that. There's that kind of genre.
Yeah, that's always makes me sort of eyebrow raise. It's just like, where did that come from?
Yeah, you get that mix of technology and swords and sorcery sometimes, which rarely works for me.
Yeah.
But yeah, this all just it blends seamlessly.
Yeah, it shouldn't work, but it does. I mean, if you said, "Oh, it's a story about these scientists from Atlantis who build a spaceship and go to Venus," so, hey, what?
And get taken over by alien monsters.
Yeah, plant monsters. It'd make a great B movie.
Oh, it would, yeah.
Well, yeah, and you can see that scene, can't you, with CGI now? That's a very visual image. The things growing out of the guy, you can really picture that. And I think it's something Smith excels at. That we're coming back to some of these stories I've read quite a lot of times, but when you read a news story, you're never quite sure where it's going. And this, at certain points, could go in certain directions, but it always goes somewhere you don't quite expect.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, especially after the last story, because while they're both set on Venus, like Gavin said, they're just completely different. Just completely different stories.
Different Venuses.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. You could possibly explain it that this is, well, whenever Atlantis was, and which story was it that you're talking about?
The Immeasurable Horror. So that was set in 1979.
Right. Well, the far future.
Yeah.
There you go. Yeah.
So this is pre-massive Shoggoth monster.
Yeah.
Maybe the massive Shoggoth monster was just a little Shoggoth monster at this point.
Yeah. Oh, little Shoggoth. Or it could, of course, like you're saying, just be on a different part of the planet. Venus is a pretty big place.
I thought the upshot in both of them, though, is don't go to Venus, isn't it? Basically, that.
It is a bit.
Avoid Venus. Saturn's all right. They've got chronicles there. You know, you can sit down and enjoy a chronicle.
Yeah. It sounds like a newspaper, doesn't it? The Saturn Chronicle. Sarfogua cult spotted spotted on the outer rim. You know?
Wouldn't that be edited by cats, though?
Oh, yeah.
Large and peculiar ones.
Yes. Is there any other kind? I suppose small and aggressive ones.
Now, Jupiter is Psychronosh, and Venus is Sfanamoe, whatever, that one. So what other planets did Clark Ashton Smith come up with funky new names for?
Saturn. I can't remember the name of it because he's mentioned
Psychronosh.
Is that Psychronosh? Right. Yeah, because he mentions that's where Sarfogua comes from and is formless spawn.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
And obviously Lovecraft had Yuggoth, which turned out to be Pluto. He predicted it.
Didn't he have a name for Mars? Was there a Martian name for Mars?
There's a story on Mars, isn't there?
There's three or four Martian stories, because there were native Martians. They've got big chests, quite tall creatures, I think.
I've read at least one of those. Yeah, but I can't remember. Yeah, I think there probably was a name for it, but it doesn't stick in my mind.
Yeah, and I'm not sure. When was Pluto discovered? That was
after what do you call it? The Whisper. Is it the Whisper in Darkness? It was not long after the story with Yuggoth was published.
Yes. Yeah.
Of course, Yuggoth is a lot bigger than Pluto, and these days Pluto isn't a planet at all.
Yeah, it's been downgraded. Absolute disgrace. Someone should start up a petition. Just get me another round of Migo wings, and I'll do
Migo wings. Yeah, Volthoom was set on Mars.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and there was a Dweller in the Gulf.
Yeah,
and a couple of others. Yeah.
Dweller in the Gulf, I think is the one I've read.
Seedling of Mars.
Yeah.
And the vaults of Yovombis.
The vaults of Yovombis. Oh, that's a classic. Yeah. Yes, all to be coming up on future episodes, of course.
Indeed, yeah.
Watch this space and time.
That sounds like something from the Outer Limits, doesn't it? To be honest, this would have made a great episode of the Outer Limits or the Twilight Zone or Night Gallery, even anything like that.
Definitely.
It has that feel, and it has that feel again. Well, there's two things. As we said, there's the falling civilization or the doomed civilization, but there's this idea that curiosity killed the cat or killed the scientists in this case, and put it back, leave it alone, don't read it, don't touch it, don't take it home, don't go there. And
then there won't be a story.
An empty book.
I love the ending of this because it's another one of Smith's brilliantly bleak endings. The last line in it, he's a master at this, of leaving you sort of going, at the end. Because such was the fate of Hotar and Evidon, the last of the Atlanteans, and the first, if not also the last, of human visitors to Sfanamoe. Yeah, that's it. You're all dead. Everybody dies.
Yeah. A lot of people say H.P. Lovecraft is like that. I mean, and they all go mad or die at the end. Well, to some extent, but usually there's a reason for it. I mean, they've gone poking around in the wrong kind of ruins, or they read the wrong kind of book, or whatever. But here it's just kind of, and then they die. They get taken over by flowers, and they die.
I think, like you say, it's a kind of a jolly, painless, pretty death, but I think
flowery death.
I think you're right. That does overlay the true horror of it. Are they still alive in there somewhere? 5 years later, is there some sort of sentience in there still? I mean, imagine that.
Well, that's what I was wondering. Yeah, I was wondering that. Is it more of a transitional thing, more of an evolution, even like similar to Hodgson's The Voice in the Night, where these people are all taken over by this colony of fungus, but they're all sort of kind of alive and linked in there, and in a really weird, horrific kind of way. It's sort of like a weird, horrible afterlife in a sort of way, It's making it even more bleak, isn't it?
Maybe what happens is Hotar and Evidon, they live on in the flowers, and the flowers eventually evolve into a giant Shoggoth thing.
There you go.
Oh, there we go.
See, it all comes full circle.
Not quite sure how that works, but
I don't know. I love it. The two Shoggoths that were fighting. Maybe that was Hotar and what's his face, Evidon. Yeah, maybe that was it.
Wow,
could be it. Flowery Shoggoths.
Flowery Shoggoths. Yes,
brings to mind Elizabeth Bear's Shoggoths in Bloom, which is a fantastic story. If you haven't read it, I would suggest you do so. It's brilliant.
Have to hunt it out.
It's done like a nature documentary about a colony, people looking at it's like a nature reserve of Shoggoths. And they bloom when they mate and things like that. It's almost David Attenborough-esque. It's really well done. It's in New Cthulhu 2, and it's also the title of her best of anthology. So yeah, but well worth checking out.
I think I shall.
So there we are. That's a voyage to Sfanamoe, Venus. And that's the last story in the Collected Fantasies Volume 1, the end of the story. So yes, as always, we'll put a link up to Nightshade Publications, who have put together these 5 volumes. And I think it's worth remembering as well that they've put so much work in to get the original texts as well, because obviously, as we mentioned throughout the series, some of these were quite heavily edited or altered by Farnsworth Wright or other people, or Smith himself, of course. So what we have here, as far as we can tell, are the unexpurgated texts.
Yeah, I was actually reading. It was I think it was one of the last stories we covered, and it was actually mentioning, because one of the great things about these books is in the back you've got like the whole, like a story of how it, when it was written, how it came together, that kind of thing, and you get some like links to letters and things like this as well. It's very useful. It's a good starting point for the research that we have to do. It's without this, it'd be a lot trickier. But in one of the last stories, it said that the additions were written in pencil in the margin. that's the version they went from, the handwritten additions in the margins. So I thought that was really nice. You know?
Amazing. Mm.
Did he type them up originally, or did he do the whole thing in?
No, I think they were typed up. I think, yeah, they were typed up, and then
because he was living in pretty primitive conditions, wasn't he? It's a shack somewhere in the middle of the wilderness, basically.
Yeah, and I think it is amazing when you think back. You know, like Howard sat at his typewriter, didn't he? I mean, Lovecraft must have typed at some point, but there seems to be quite a lot of Lovecraft handwritten versions or drafts of the stories.
Yeah,
I think in the John Hay Library. So that'll be an interesting thing to look at, is how Smith worked as well. In fact, what we're going to do next episode is we're going to do a wrap up of season 1, and I think that's something we'll look at, how Smith actually worked as well.
Yes,
we haven't really spoken about that so much yet. Just recovering the stories. Tim mentioned the letters there as well, and there's not much in the letters between Smith and Lovecraft on this one, but we do get this. This is early September 1930, en route to Aldebaran at the dawn of the Grey Nebula.
Nice.
Dear H. Pi L, and he mentions, your letter enclosing Sfanamoe was received, which presumably was a copy that's coming back to Smith. I love the way they used to send copies to each other of these incredible manuscripts going through the post. I mean, you wouldn't risk it these days, would you?
They sometimes went through 6 or 7 pairs of hands as well, because Lovecraft would then send it on to Donald Wandrei, who then send it on to Robert Bloch, who then send it on to Frank Belknap Long, who then send it on to Derleth, who then send it back to Smith.
Incredible. It's incredible. So your letter enclosing Sfanamoe was received. Glad you like this story, which is not a favourite with me. So Smith didn't seem to like this one too much. He doesn't describe it as a dud as he did, that story a couple of episodes back. But I enjoyed it, and I thought all those things we've spoken about. I think it's one of his better stories. Maybe not top tier, but certainly up there.
Wonderfully weird.
Yeah,
wonderfully weird,
and that's what you really want.
Definitely. I mean, just the visuals alone of these poor chaps with daffodils sprouting out out their ears and stuff.
Is that a Carry On reference?
Yes, it is indeed.
But you might explain the weird alien they first see that's got something growing out of its orchidaceous blossoms springing from their rumps. Maybe that's they've been taken over as well. They were perfectly normal creatures with more than the usual number of legs beforehand.
Yeah, that's quite thingy as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
Thing-like thingy.
Yeah.
That sort of
taken over.
Yeah, and altered in some way.
Yeah.
I mean, we're sort of straight shadow out of Innsmouth, really, there as well, aren't we? In that sense.
Yeah. One thing that I brought to mind is a recent trailer. The end of last year, Konami actually announced some new Silent Hill games. And one of the new ones is Silent Hill F. Check out the trailer, because it's actually set in Japan, unusually. And basically the trailer is this girl, and going through the trailer, getting taken over by these blooms. So you got like sprouts coming out of the paws in her hands, and her face turning into like a massive rose, almost rose-like, but I think it's fungal. But and then her face falling off. It's quite horrific, and that's what I had in my head while I was reading this. So yeah,
it's a similar idea. I suppose it comes from the way flowers and things like that grow out of rotting leaves, rotting whatever. The idea that they could grow out of you,
mulch. Yeah, that's why the whole point of why I did that novella, Miracle Growth, and that basically that comes from, I had in my head humus, more humus than human. Because obviously humus being the growth medium, and that was it. That's where the story came from, just stupid wordplay. And so
Yeah, that's good. I remember there's a Flashman story set in India, and there was a description of this fakir who had a tree growing out, well, sapling, little tree growing out of his hand. Presumably, somehow or other, it had a cut or something like that. It was some kind of religious thing, mortification of the flesh. But I don't know if that's based on reality or not. Could you actually end up with plants growing out of you? We can have fungal infestations. I know that much.
Oh yeah.
It's like, I always remember growing up, my gran always used to say, make sure you wash behind your ears or you get potatoes sprouting.
Yeah.
Well, you certainly hear of people with things in their ears and various foreign objects. 14 times normally has something every issue of something being removed from a person, one orifice or another. But I suppose if the conditions are right and you provide the correct nutrients for something, then anything could grow. And I always have like a kind of serial killer story. You can imagine it using humans as grow bags. Like you have those bags and you slit them open and you put your tomato plants in. There's a little.
That's a great idea. Yeah, but the thing is, I've read the same sort of thing. It probably is like 14 times or something like that. But I've read sort of stories about people's dreadlocks, like people having things growing in their dreadlocks, like they've had seeds land in there, it's germinated, and a plant growing out of the dread. So I mean.
So, dear listeners, if any of you has a petunia growing out of you or something similar, do write in and let us know. Actually, don't write in. We want to see pictures. So, but plants, we don't want to see any unusual growths or bumps or lumps. That's we can see those sort of things on telly. So, it has to be living, symbiotic.
Indeed.
All right. So, do let us know what you think of that story. And once again, if you want to take issue with any of our pronunciations, then feel free.
Some manglings tonight, haven't there?
Especially Sfanamoe.
Yes.
It's a shame there's no audio of Smith, is there, reading it? I mean, given that he lived up until quite recent times, I can understand with Lovecraft and Howard, they really went, just like wax cylinders were available then, I guess. But Smith lived on into the age of cassette recordings and stuff. Are there any recordings of his voice at all? Does anyone know?
Not sure. That rings a vague bell, but I couldn't really say.
Yeah, surprising there isn't, because there's lots of TV. There's even TV footage of Algernon Blackwood, isn't there? Yeah. He did a series of readings, didn't he, on the TV?
He was on the radio, and even Dunsany, I think, was on TV or something like that. Yeah. Well, perhaps if anyone out there does know, that's something we'll research as well.
Wikipedia, live from Auburn, the Elder Tapes.
Oh.
In the late 1950s, Smith recorded a number of his poems on tape recorder of his friend Robert B. Elder.
Okay. Interesting. We'll have to look that up.
Yeah, that's something we need to track down.
Clark Ashton Smith has even got a discography.
Blimey.
Explore releases from Clark Ashton Smith at Discogs, shop for vinyl CD.
Cool.
Wow.
Awesome.
Wow, that's definitely something we'll be tracking down then. Thanks, Gavin.
Hell yeah. Nice one, man. Yeah.
Okay, now we've had a couple of questions and comments come in from last shows. Our friend Ralph Grasso has made a comment on episode 15 about the, I believe it's the cannibalism issue, Tim.
Indeed, yeah. He mentions that Clark Ashton Smith was spot on with cannibalism in New Guinea. It had been outlawed but continues, and the Dayaks are headhunters as well. I believe that is how one of the Rockefellers went missing while with the Peace Corps. There is a disease associated with eating human flesh, and it still shows up in New Guinea. The Jivaros of South America still headhunt as well, to a much lesser degree. It stems from tribal warfare and does not involve explorers or visitors.
Keep it in the family.
It's a bit grisly, isn't it?
It is. That sounds like some sort of ritualistic thing, perhaps, or something.
Yeah.
The brain thing that he's talking about, that's prions. And you remember mad cow disease?
Yeah.
That's the same thing. And it came from the same source, that they were actually chopping up cow carcasses and putting them in cow feed. And as a result, the cows were basically cannibal cows, involuntary cannibal cows. And that's why they started getting mad cow disease.
Yeah, I remember that.
And then, of course, people got it from eating them. That's a real horror story.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah,
it is, and that was quite a horrible thing as well, wasn't it? The people who called it, it was very unpleasant. Yeah.
Yeah, we had another message from Ralph Grasso on the last episode about the immeasurable horror. He says that he always finds Smith's sci-fi to be wonderful, both Mars and Venus. His description of landscape, the alien creatures, the creepy to the humanoid, are way above the average sci-fi writers of the past. Yeah, I couldn't agree more, to be honest. It's that richness of language, isn't it?
Yeah, and the originality as well.
Yeah.
He just came up with wonderfully original ideas. Most people think, oh, well, stick in a few kind of robots and green monsters and that kind of thing, usual kind of thing, all the cliches.
Well, yeah, we always say normally it's the bloke in the rubber suit and the monster is the bloke in a rubber suit. But with Smith, you get things that are just, I suppose way beyond what could be filmed at the time.
Yeah.
I don't think even CGI would do justice to it.
No, it's such a contrast to Star Trek's like people painted blue, isn't it? I couldn't see Captain Kirk trying to get off with any of Clark Ashton Smith's aliens.
I mean, he'd have a bloody good try. He'd have a bloody good try.
He probably would, yeah.
He'd end up with orchidaceous blooms coming out from where he didn't want them.
I'm sure Bones has got some ointment that he can administer. To be fair, though, they did have the Hauler, which was, slightly Shogothy in the mines, and had a couple that were sort of gas cloud type monsters as well, didn't they? I suppose, which I suppose that's a budget monster, isn't it? Look, it's over there. You can't see it. It's an invisible gas cloud.
And of course, Tribbles, which was basically somebody's wig on a string.
Looked more like a merkin to me. But
it did look like a merkin.
Perhaps we best not go there. And we've had one other message in as well. This is from Justin Kahn via email. And Justin asks, just wondering why you didn't mention the mainstream fiction that Edith Wharton is better known for on the Strange Shadows episode 16. Thanks, Justin, for sending that in. Well, I think really we just mentioned Wharton as a name in passing. We just wondered if the name of the character was a nod to Edith Wharton. But if you are interested in that type of fiction, then do take a listen to the Innsmouth Book Club. We're going to be covering over the next, for 2 or 3 episodes, weird women authors. So we're going to be looking at Nesbit and some other authors as well. I'm sure we'll be looking at Edith Wharton as well in that.
Indeed. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, yeah. One last thing I want to mention is last time I was talking about a story with a similar creature in it by Donald Wandry, and I couldn't for the life of me remember what the story was called. The story that features the big amoeboid Shogothy blob things is called The Destroying Horde, and it's a cracking story. It's proper bit of pulp. It's great. It's a great story.
So there we are, folks. That's the end of our first series. Big thanks to Gavin again for coming in.
Thank you.
And we hope to see you in our next season as well, as we get into more goodness, more Smithian goodness.
Looking forward to it.
Thanks also for those people who sent in questions. You can get in contact with us at our Facebook page or via email at innsmouthbookclub@outlook.com, or of course on our Patreon site. And while you're on our Patreon site, do take a look at signing up to help support the podcast. When you sign up as a patron, you get not only bonus content for Strange Shadows, but also the Innsmouth Book Club bonus episodes. And you also get a monthly copy of Innsmouth News and various other items as well. Thanks to everyone who supported us so far for this series. We have hit over 1,500 downloads now, which we're very pleased with. So let's go on to even greater things in season 2. Thanks to our patrons, our YouTube subscribers, and to all our followers. As we said, next time we're going to do a wrap-up. I think we might have another special guest or two in, so we hope you can join us. Thanks again for listening, and with that, it's goodbye from me, Rob Poynton.
And it's goodbye from me, Tim Mendes.